The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Dying of Whiteness, how the politics of racial resentment is killing America's heartland. Plus, Kochland, the secret history of Koch Industries and corporate power in America. And Bill Press talks with Wisconsin Congressman Mark Pocan, co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Why are so many working-class white Americans willing to support policies that are making them sick and may even lead to their death? That's the question that led Johnathan Metzl to spend 6 years talking to Trump supporters. And what he found out tells us an alarming story about the politics of race and its impact on public health. And we say hello to Johnathan Metzl, director of the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. He's also the author of Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. Johnathan Metzl, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. This is a book about why so many people in America right now are supporting politics and policies that are actually shortening their lives. So let's start with these people, with who these people are. Who did you talk to in the course of researching and writing this book?
Sure. Well, I mean, basically the book represents about 5 or 6 years of research where I went around states like Kansas, Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, places where I live. I'm a white Midwesterner. I grew up in Kansas City. I now live in Tennessee. And I really kind of talked to people and assessed the implications of what happened if you lived in a state that, for example, blocked the Affordable Care Act and didn't do the Medicaid expansion, or if you lived in a state that had huge tax cuts for wealthy people that ended up cutting away funding for schools or roads or bridges, or if you lived in a state where it became ever easier to get guns. And what I found was that, certainly there was a diversity of opinions, but on the aggregate level, basically those policies, cutting away healthcare, blocking healthcare reform, cutting away education, etc., they became as dangerous to people as other man-made risk factors like asbestos or not wearing seatbelts in cars or secondhand smoke. They literally became factors that shortened people's lifespans. And the irony, tragic irony in a way, was the people who I found who were suffering, don't want to say the most, but were suffering a very disproportionate share very often, were not wealthy people. It was working class people, including white working class communities who very often were supporting politicians who enacted these policies in the first place.
Well, and in placing whiteness in the center of your work in this book, it's worth talking about how you define whiteness. So how do you understand the construction of whiteness today in America, and do you see it changing?
Right. Well, I want to be clear. I'm not talking about whiteness as a biological category. I didn't go around and ask people, to take a cheek swab or something like that. Really what I'm talking about is the rise of a particular politics that is anti-immigrant, anti-government, pro-gun, that really became, it was once a fringe position in the GOP that became a core position of the GOP. And so really what I'm talking about is the rise of policies that came about through the Tea Party and the Freedom Caucus and the Trump administration, and how those politics, on one hand, play to a sense of white racial resentment. I mean, this idea idea that basically immigrants and minorities are taking away your jobs, or they're taking resources that should be yours. And so really what I found was that when those policies started to enter the mainstream and started to set public policy in particular states, that they ended up shortening everybody's lifespans, including those of white working class Americans. So it's really the rise of these politics of racial resentment that I track. What I found are some pretty jarring numbers. I mean, in a way, for example, blocking the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion ended up costing everybody in the state of Tennessee about a month of life expectancy. So the replies were not just for people who may or may not have been racist or identified with a particular way. It really was a story about how when you elect politicians whose politics are based in this, everybody's health suffers.
And I don't think I haven't heard of anybody who has looked at it from this perspective, and so I find this kind of refreshing as well as jarring to hear it talked about this way. Guns are an important part in your work. How should we understand why people would support gun policies that actually are not in their interest, and what's the price they pay?
Right. Well, I've been studying guns for a long time, and I certainly, as somebody who's a Midwesterner who has many friends in my life who are on all sides of this issue, I can certainly respect that there are long traditions in many states in this country of gun ownership and hunting and family traditions of gun ownership. But really what I look at in the book are what happens when there are policies that basically upend any kind of common sense gun legislation, saying that you can carry guns into bars and parks and hospitals, lowering the age of open carry and concealed carry to 18, overturning bans on semi-automatic weapons. And really, I found two things. Number one is that the way that they kind of get people on board with those particular policies is to play to very strong racial traditions in this country. Again, not to say that everybody who owns a gun is a racist by any stretch, but I just started looking at advertisements and the histories of guns, and there was all this coded language about protecting yourself from others and strangers, and to use the NRA's language, protect yourself from gangbangers and carjackers. So there was this racial tension about gun ownership that helped fuel in part the spread of these particular kinds of laws. And then I just looked at the data, and it turned out the people who were suffering the most were not gangbangers or carjackers. It turned out that when I studied states like Missouri and Kansas and Tennessee, the biggest rise in gun-related injury and death was actually white gun-owning men, because rates of white gun suicides skyrocketed in these states as it became easier to get guns. And so, again, it was a tension between politics that were being sold as a kind of defense of a kind of notion of whiteness. And I realize that sounds kind of loaded, but please read the book if you want to see more about that on one hand. And then on the other hand, really this story about how these politics ended up literally shortening white lifespans.
And again, this rise in the people taking their own life, turning the gun on themselves, also directly related to these policies?
Well, it's pretty interesting, actually. I mean, if you think about it as a country, we have about 40,000 gun deaths a year, roughly, in this country. If you just watch the news or listen to politicians, you would think that this was all, gang-related shooting or terrorism, something like that. Turns out about 26,000 gun deaths, two-thirds of our gun deaths in this country are gun suicide. And of those numbers, 85% are white gun-owning men, right? So there's an epidemic of gun death among white gun-owning men. We're seeing rises in these categories in farmers and people in rural communities, factors like that, but you never really hear about it, And so, again, I'm just trying to point out the inconsistency between presenting guns as being defenders of, self and property, which is, in some ways true, but then also not telling the story of who the victims are of this kind of issue. And again, just trying to say that we need to talk much more openly about what's happening here.
Yeah, absolutely. We're speaking with Johnathan Metzl. He's the author of Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. Johnathan, let's also talk about health care here. How do the politics of resentment play into how we might view health care?
Well, in the book, I talk a lot about the research that I did with some of my colleagues leading up to and during the time of the Affordable Care Act. we did research in Tennessee, right? Tennessee is a state that, even though the Affordable Care Act had been passed by Congress and the Senate and the president at the time, that Tennessee was one of the southern states that was actively involved in blocking the Medicaid expansion, undermining the healthcare marketplaces. And we did focus groups across Tennessee and Kentucky, talking to people about their attitudes about healthcare reform. And it was probably one of the more powerful parts of the research of the book. Talked to very medically ill people in Tennessee, poor white people, and said, hey, the Affordable Care Act is coming. If they expand Medicaid, it could really help you and your family by lowering your medical costs, lowering your costs of prescription drugs, easier access to doctors. And again we heard, well, I know it might benefit me, but I don't want to sign on to a system that's going to be gamed by immigrants and minorities. That was what people's fear was about it. And I lead the book with the story of a guy named Trevor who was literally dying of liver failure, and said, I know I'm dying. I know I could use the medical care, but I'm not signing up for a system that, as he said it, quote, will benefit Mexicans and welfare queens, unquote. And this person did pass away over the course of our research. And so this idea that basically here's a program that might benefit me that's coming from the government, but it would also benefit immigrants and minorities, at least in our research, drove a lot of the resistance to the Affordable Care Act. And ultimately, when we crunched the numbers, it turned out that, it was devastating across the state, that kind of ideology. We found dramatic falling life expectancy in people who couldn't access health care because of that decision.
That is awfully disturbing, that story alone, and I'm sure it's one of many, unfortunately. And Johnathan, obviously this is a book about how people feel. To what extent did you hear people talk in a way about these feelings beyond a sense of abstract fear? I mean, did you hear very concrete descriptions of what might happen if their world becomes more equitable and white privilege is challenged?
Mm-hmm. And again, I want to be clear that not everybody I spoke with was espousing some kind of racist ideology. Really, the big risk factor came if you lived in a state where your elected politicians were enacting these anti-government, anti-immigrant, pro-gun policies. And so that really was the risk factor, was who you elected, not so much how you felt. But again, that's driven by deep, profound emotions. And a good part of the book talks about how when we enact policies based on trying to screw over other people rather than helping everyone, that in a way everyone's health suffers. That's the main story of the book. But in the last part of the book, I then look at societies where that's not the case, where people are driven by a sense of kind of common cause. Not everybody, but the systems that they elect, universal health care or equitable societies or more diverse workplaces, that in a way it's the opposite story, that really when you have a more equitable workforce, when you have more people who can tap into the dream of having a better economic reality, that everybody's boat rises when that happens. And so the end of the book is telling the story about how more horizontal policies are better for everyone, not just for particular groups.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as we well know, there are more than enough politicians willing to take advantage of the politics of resentment. And this, of course, goes all the way to the top with our president. How powerful are these politicians in their ability to influence how we think and feel?
Very, very powerful. I mean, again, the things they're tapping into, I'm not in any way going to endorse, racism, but I would say that this idea of other people are going to come take what's yours, or you had privilege that was once yours that is being lost. There are deep historical tensions about that. And in a way, I think that the role of responsible government is to be equitable and to be reassuring about this instead of tapping into these deep fault lines and just making things worse. And I think, unfortunately, that's what we're seeing now is it's gotten so bad that people are so afraid that other people are going to take what's theirs or harm them or something, that really we're making a series of decisions that are, at least from a statistical and health perspective, completely irrational as a country.
Mm-hmm. They're pushing the snowball down the hill, and it grows and grows and grows. Many political scientists and sociologists are noting that we are becoming a more segregated society, not only by race, but also ideology. And one of the observations made is that when we actually live with each other, our fear of the other begins to fade. The people who live in more diverse environments tend to be less racist than those who don't. Could the solution to this problem really be that simple?
It's an interesting phenomenon. I spent 5 years. I'm somebody who lives in Tennessee, but I spent 5 years talking to people with a range of different political opinions, and I found just how powerful it was to actually talk to people. People that you would normally probably hate on Twitter. And when you talk to people up close, it's like, politics is one part of their lives, but also family and sports and community and religion, all these other factors that you may or may not have in common. And so when we're just fighting with each other on Twitter and polarizing, as you say, along every fault line, it really made me think a lot in writing this book about who are the agents who are polarizing us, because it does seem like the minute you start to fracture society in these ways, not only is it terrible for our outcomes, but you lose the avenues for actually having conversations that might not be so polarizing. And so part of what I argue throughout the book is let's look closely at the forces of polarization that are fracturing our society, because there are a lot of forces that benefit from polarization, financially or politically. And let's think about a way to maybe work back against that, because even with all these, the tension of this moment, I really feel like we're better off trying to bridge these divides rather than continue to be fractured, which ultimately will lead us to even worse outcomes.
We're speaking with Johnathan Metzl, director of the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, also the author of Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. And Johnathan, as a doctor, you've played a powerful role in developing a way to practice medicine that directly takes on the social, economic, racial, and political factors that affect our health. It's called structural competency. How does that work?
Well, structural competency is a big move that actually came about while we were also doing the research here on the whiteness, because basically I started to see how many problems that seem racial or political are actually structural. People are living in communities that don't have transit networks. They can't get to a hospital when they're sick. There's no healthy food because they live in a food desert. There are bad schools in their areas. And I just felt like the medical community really needed to get involved much more in these community level engagements, with really looking at how many health problems in our country are the result of structural and political problems about resources and food networks and transit networks. And so we're starting a project here that really tries to train doctors to become much more fluent in these social and socioeconomic factors that really have profound health implications.
Well, as the political season rolls out, we will be hearing a great deal about healthcare policies, I imagine. Taking into account your work confronting health disparities and your work doing this book, what are some of the policy ideas that you hope will gain traction?
Well, I spent 5 years studying the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act, it was kind of like your first iPhone or like Atari Pong, some early version of a technology that everybody assumed would be improved over time. Even in that first iteration, for better or worse, when we started to create competitive marketplaces and Medicaid expansion, people saw dramatic improvements not just in health outcomes, but in health finances. Fewer medical bankruptcies, prescription drugs got cheaper. And so, if sanity ever ruled, you would think that we would take legislation that's already passed and bolster and improve that. And so partially just doing this research made me a fan of what the Affordable Care Act could become if we had investment in it across the system. I realize that's probably a little bit politically tame for a lot of people, but it did make me think, when you look statistically at the gain we could realize as a society by really improving the Affordable Care Act to what it could possibly be. Again, legislation that's already been passed. So that would be number one. Of course, I think some move toward common sense gun reform that looks at, in the book I look at background checks and permit to purchase legislation. All the legislation I looked at was effective in making society more safer. So some kind of move toward common sense gun reform. And I also think we should look closely at what gets cut when there are tax cuts and reinvesting in education. So I don't know if you'd win an election based on those common sense proposals, but I certainly think that the data I have in my book shows how effective they are for everyone.
It does seem like it's a little bit too much common sense for the political world we have today, that's for sure. And again, another thing too, nice reference to the Atari Pong. I don't know that I've heard that in 30 years. So.
I tried to work that out. I tried to think of like what's a technology, again, a technology that we forget version 1.0 of this thing because, but that's true for all of our, that's true for all of our legislation. The idea is you pass it and then you improve it based on the real world. And instead with the Affordable Care Act, what we did was we passed it and it's been continually undermined.
Yeah, and it's such a huge mistake. It was a great starting point, a place to build, and we've gone the other direction. Hopefully we can get back there. Johnathan Metzl, author of Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. You should check this book out. Johnathan, thank you for your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We'd love to have you back again and chat some more soon.
That sounds great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the building of a conservative empire. Christopher Leonard on his latest book, Kochland. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The awful truth about the corporate and governmental power elites in our democratic society is that they really don't like democracy at all. They prefer to rule by buying lawmakers, hiring lobbyists, running Orwellian PR campaigns, and relying on authoritarian police power to control the people. They pay lip service to our right to protest, but they mean we should send emails, letters, and phone calls to our Congress critters. About as effective as screaming "stop it" at a Category 5 hurricane. But Americans are innately rebellious, so ultimately they push back against the stupidity and avarice of elites. Witness the 31 members of Greenpeace who dared to exercise their First Amendment rights to assemble and speak out forcefully against the fossil fuel industry's destruction of humanity's living environment. To be heard, these stalwarts amplified their voice with a creative, direct-action protest. They teamed up to dangle 11 of their members from a massive 440-foot-high bridge spanning the Houston Ship Channel, the largest petrochemical waterway in the U.S. The idea was to momentarily stop the 700,000 barrels of climate-altering oil that Exxon, Chevron, Shell, and others ship out under this one bridge every day, thus dramatizing the destructive scale of fossil fuel use. It worked. For some 18 hours, the activists stayed suspended, and no tankers moved through the channel. This is Jim Hightower saying, but the larger political message was that if just 11 inveterate democracy protesters can stall the big oil colossus, the great majority of people who want to stop climate destruction for good can do it by rising up in force. As one of the bridge climbers put it, I want to show people that we have the power to pressure our politicians and change our system. We know there's a better world out there, but we have to demand it.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The phrase Koch Brothers has become synonymous with the outsized influence of wealth and conservative ideology on American politics, and for good reason. In his newest book, journalist Christopher Leonard tells the story of how the Koch brothers amassed their vast wealth and explores their enormous clout. And we say hello to Christopher Leonard, business reporter whose work has appeared in The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Fortune, and Bloomberg Businessweek. He's also the author of The Meat Racket and, most recently, Kochland, The History of Koch Industries and Corporate Power in America. Chris Leonard, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, and our pleasure to have you with us. This book, Chris, is largely about how the Koch brothers amassed their wealth. And after David Koch's death in August, his fortune was estimated somewhere between $42 billion and $50.5 billion, give or take a few dollars, I guess. The story, though, begins with Fred Koch and a few oil refineries. What can you tell us about him?
Well, yeah. So the Koch brothers we hear about are David and Charles, and as you pointed out, David just passed away. And their father, Fred, was a wealthy industrialist who started this company that is essentially Koch Industries, although it had a different name, back in the 1930s. And so Fred Koch was this sort of hard-charging Midwestern industrialist guy, and he was also a very hardcore right-wing political activist. He was actually co-founder of the John Birch Society, which was this sort of secretive right-wing group that believed the federal government had been infiltrated by communists. And the reason that's important is the Koch brothers were raised in this environment where the government wasn't just seen as inefficient or ineffective. I mean, it was seen as evil. It was seen as the sort of Trojan horse of tyranny. And you can see how that political outlook, how they embraced that and then sort of refined it as they grew up.
Now, of course, so Fred Koch dies in 1967. Charles Koch takes over. What did that mean for the way the business would be run?
So this is really, I believe, the story starts in 1967 when Fred Koch dies and Charles Koch takes over. Charles Koch has very defined views of, first of all, how corporations ought to be run. But then to be candid, he also has very clear views about how society ought to be run and how America ought to be organized. In essence, Charles Koch kind of added to his father's conservatism with this very libertarian free market view that was influenced by Hayek and von Mises and these Austrian economists like that. Charles Koch essentially believes that societies need to be organized around a free market and nothing else, just a voluntary exchange. And he's really made his corporation, Koch Industries, this mini utopia of free market ideals. He's kept it privately held for decades, which means that he has really untrammeled control over how it operates. And by staying private, he's managed to keep himself away from these sort of short-term incentives that a lot of publicly traded companies have become subject to. He's not worried about the next quarter's profits or even the profits for the end of the year. Truly, the people that run this company are thinking on a strategic horizon of 2, 5, even 10 years out. And it's allowed them to be very patient, very strategic. And, under Charles Koch's leadership, they have exploded into a corporate Goliath. I mean, it was kind of a mid-sized company when Charles Koch took over, and now it truly is a global behemoth, and its annual sales are bigger than that of Facebook, Goldman Sachs, and U.S. Steel combined.
And you sort of touched on this. Your book references this story as a quote-unquote secret history. Secrecy has a lot of meaning in this story. Why was this so important to Charles Koch, and what has he done over the years to protect it?
Okay, so the root of this is, I think, important to understand. It's strategic. This isn't just like James Bond villain style secrecy. The book opens in 1981 when these bankers from New York come to Wichita. They try to convince Charles Koch to take the company public, and he sends them packing. And I got the memo that they wrote when they got back home to New York, and it was so illuminating. One of the things Charles Koch told them is that if we go public, people are going to figure out how much money our commodities traders are making. And if they know that, they're going to stop doing business with us when they realize how much we're profiting off of these trades. And to me, that was so important, and it shows that secrecy is embedded in the strategy of this company. Koch is really at heart a trading firm. They've been buying and selling energy supplies around the globe since the 60s, and the whole secret of success in that line of work is to know more about the world than anybody you're trading with, and of course you keep your knowledge secret. And so from there, that DNA has expanded into the very secretive corporate Goliath you see today, and even the political network. I mean, both the company and the political network, they kind of operate in the world through this dizzying constellation of shell companies and mini corporations and LLCs and these weird 501c4s that they do their political action through. All of that is very intentional. They're adding complexity to obscure the shape of the actual organization and their goals and methods.
And, you mentioned the political part of it all. This is also a book about how the Koch brothers have used their wealth to influence politics in America. They've spent hundreds of millions of dollars to push their agendas. Do you see this push as one that is largely ideological in motivation or simple self-interest?
I mean, this is a huge question. As Charles Koch's political network has become more prominent, they constantly say that they only lobby in Washington, D.C. In the public interest, essentially to help poor people, because they want to make America more free of regulation, which they think will spur prosperity. And then you've got the critical, cynical view that they're out there only lobbying to benefit their corporation. And heck, there's a lot of evidence of that. When you look back at the lobbying disclosure reports for Koch Industries, it's totally focused on arcane matters that affect their business: chemical safety law, environmental pollution law, energy taxes, and things like that. At the end of the day, after writing about this for years, I have to come to this really unsatisfactory conclusion, which is that they are true believer ideologues. There's no doubt about it. And they're in this convenient position where the idealistic ideologue positions they push for also benefit this massive corporate empire. So it is truly a mix of both. But I have to say, at the end of the day, when you look at prioritize, it does tie back to the business. I mean, we can talk about this if you want, but one of their biggest lobbying efforts has been around stalling and derailing any climate change regulation. And that is, it's tied in a core way to their fossil fuels business. So, you got to say they do prioritize things that affect their business for sure.
Well, and the other thing, Chris, I was going to ask how you can follow where this money gets put to use, and obviously it goes far beyond campaign contributions. But for such a secret corporation, do they try and hide where they're putting it and sort of put up veils and that kind of thing, playing that shell game? Is that their whole MO?
I mean, just without question, it's not a controversial point. They employ an intentionally complex network of shells to advance their political interests. And I mean, big picture, Charles Koch since the 70s has been talking about moving American politics toward a more libertarian view. So he helped co-found this think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Cato Institute, which appears to be this independent, libertarian-minded think tank. But it really is a vehicle for Charles Koch to advance his views. But it gets way more granular than that. And it's very hard for outsiders to learn how it works. Because I spent so much time on this, I interviewed a lot of the senior political operatives that would, create these shells. And they would kind of explain to me how the Koch network would get money. They would give it to a think tank, for example, to secretly sponsor a study. And then the study would be published without having Koch's name on it. And then Koch's other think tanks that they control and political action groups would take that study and then use it to make political ads to target vulnerable politicians. So I think it's really only by talking to people on the inside that you can get a view, of how this map works and how the system works, because it is designed to obscure what's behind it, if you will.
Yeah. We're speaking with Chris Leonard, business reporter and author of a couple different books. His most recent, Kochland, The History of Koch Industries and Corporate Power in America. And Chris, I find it fascinating and frightening to examine the influence of the Koch brothers. You touched on the environment a few moments ago, and you're right that Koch Industries was the most flagrant violators of environmental laws in the United States during the 1990s. What allowed them to largely get away with it?
Well, and we do have to point out, to be fair to the company, the 1990s, one of the chapters about the 1990s is called Off the Rails. I mean, they were growing really fast in the 90s. They were committing major crimes, major civil violations. They racked up a laundry list of record-breaking fines. And they did change their tune in the year 2000 because in some ways they did not get away with it. For example, I mean, they had record-breaking fines for pipeline violations, for pollution, for air pollution violations, and it caused them to change their operations and clean up their act, which you really did see, play out in the 2000s. But, to go back to that time when they were breaking the law, this really reflects life in America, where you've got very large corporations that can afford essentially an army of very talented attorneys, and they operate in these areas where the law is gray. If you or I went into a convenience store and stole a large soft drink, it would be very clear we committed a crime. But if you game the Clean Air Act to literally expand an oil refinery without complying with air quality rules, it is almost impossible for the government to prove you commit a crime. I mean, I interviewed the prosecutors actually on that case. Koch did sign a settlement for violating the Clean Air Act with other oil refiners, but it takes years of litigation. It's very complex, and big companies have the advantage to fend off prosecution like that.
It's amazing to me. It really is. And so, moving forward, they begin to zero in the brothers Koch on greenhouse gas emissions. Why? Well, I guess I can assume why it was so important to them, but how have they influenced how we actually talk about climate change?
So the reason I reported so deeply on this is because I was interviewing, former and current Koch lobbyists and political operatives, and one of them told me carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, this was their top priority issue. It was seen as an existential threat to the company if the government passed regulations on greenhouse gases. And the sort of trail of footprints is absolutely clear. I mean, even back in 1991, Koch Industries was helping support groups that were casting doubt on the science of climate change, like the Cato Institute, which held a big seminar back in 91 talking about the doubt, is climate change real or not? And that continues literally up through today, casting doubt on the science. And look, the science is totally clear that when you put gigatons of carbon in the air, it accumulates there, it makes the planet warmer. Scientists always want to talk in very specific language with caveats, and that's where these lobbyists can kind of seize the initiative to point to any source of doubt. And Koch continues to do that today. But more importantly, I think tactically, they have punished Republicans who cross orthodoxy on this. There's a guy in the book named Bob Inglis who was as conservative as you can get. He's from South Carolina. He looked at the evidence, realized climate change was a big threat. Koch primaried him and helped played a major role in kicking him out of the office. I mean, organized Tea Partiers to go to his town halls and all the rest of it. And I think they played a very important role in shaping the Republican Party so that today you can't even admit what's happening around us, which is that carbon's accumulating in the atmosphere and it's warming the earth.
Just amazing. And I continue to say the same thing over and over again because it's all so amazing. This book also tells a story of the Koch influence on workers' lives. And part of that story is their use of the labor management system. What did this mean for day-to-day work inside a Koch business and, quite frankly, even beyond the confines of their industries?
Yes, I'm so grateful that you brought that up because it's a huge thread in the book. One of the biggest, things that I wanted to explore is why can we have a decade of economic growth in this country and yet most Americans barely advance economically? Because that's where we are. And the life of workers, and to be totally candid, the role of labor unions, it all plays a really big part of that. And I spent years reporting at a very massive Koch Industries distribution center in Portland, Oregon. It's actually run by Koch's Georgia Pacific division. And I interviewed these employees who'd been in a labor union. Some of them had been at this center since the 70s. And what you see, this reflects what's going on across America. With each passing year, workers have less and less leverage, less and less bargaining power, and work becomes more and more onerous. I mean, you mentioned that labor management system Koch uses. It's a software system whereby these people show up at work, they plug into the system, they're told what to do every minute of the day until they're done. And Koch would, for a while, actually rank each employee based on how quickly they did the job, and it posted the rankings. And if you're at the bottom of the rankings, you could get disciplined or fired. So it was systematically dividing workers against each other. And even as the job became more dangerous, which is shown by Koch's own internal safety data that a whistleblower gave me, the job is getting more dangerous every year. The workers are getting paid less than they did in the 80s when you adjust for inflation. So this is a very important picture about what's going on with wage workers in America today. And I think it helps explain a lot of the alienation and a lot of the anger you see out there right now.
I can't help but thinking we're talking about crime after crime after crime, and yet there they go off, on their merry way and continuing to do all these things. A little something from you about your book. How does this book help us better understand how capitalism has changed in America? Yeah,
I really do see this book as, it is the story of Koch, but I wanted to write a succinct and readable economic history of the U.S., basically from the 60s until today. And things have really changed during that time. Income inequality was far lower back in the 60s than it is today. When the economy grew, the gains were shared far more broadly back in the 60s than they were today. The story of Koch helps us understand what happened, and I think it helps us understand that the shape of capitalism isn't accidental. Markets and economies aren't something that are handed down from heaven. This is all policy choices made in the United States. And, Charles Koch, more than anybody, will tell you, politics and economics are not separate things. They're totally intertwined. So I think it helps walk us through the history of what's happened in this country to get us where we are right now.
Chris Leonard, business reporter whose work has appeared in The Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Fortune, and Bloomberg Business Week. He's the author of The Meat Racket and, as we've been talking about today, most recently, Kochland, The History of Koch Industries and Corporate Power in America. Chris, we appreciate your time with us today and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thanks so much for the time. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The progressive agenda on healthcare, climate change, trade, and 2020. Bill Press talks with Congressman Mark Pocan of Wisconsin, co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus.
Climate change. Congress seems to be stuck on that issue, unable to move. Any glimmer of hope?
We printed some bumper stickers for my campaign last year that said, if the people lead, eventually the leaders will follow. I really believe that. You know, people are way ahead on this. If you look at public opinion, they get that scientists have told us we may be past the break-even point of actually being able to keep the planet alive. And that means we have to act. And that's why things like the Green New Deal get the attention they get. Because people know we need to do something more than we're doing. The problem, I think, as everyone knows, is Mitch McConnell and President Trump aren't going to do anything. They're not going to stand up to the fossil fuel industry. They're not going to stand up to corporate polluters. So it's hard to see something happening with the current makeup of Congress. I do think that when you look at all the Democratic presidential candidates talking very seriously about this issue, and I think, when you look at members of Congress who want to do more on this issue, then I think so far we've taken a vote to get back into the Paris Climate Agreement, but we actually have a special committee that Kathy Castor is chairing about climate change, and we've got other committees dealing with it. We've got more we need to do and want to do, but we're going to need some changes of who's in charge of the Senate and who's in charge of the White House.
Well, you mentioned the Green New Deal. What do you tell people, sometimes even among Democrats, you hear this argument, we have to have an economic message, not an environmental message. We have to talk about jobs. We can't talk about renewable energy or solar or wind.
No, I mean, they're totally related, right? If you invest, we all want to invest in our infrastructure, but you can do it in a green, sustainable way, and that helps. I always look at, I was told, and I don't know how true this is, but 98% of what we spend on energy in Wisconsin leaves Wisconsin. That includes gasoline, right? Because we don't have that here. But I know that we have wind production in Wisconsin. I know we have solar production. I have 8.5 kilowatts on my roof myself. I love to get a $7 bill for a month occasionally. There's so many things that we can do that create jobs here in the United States. And you can, to make those things, to make those big windmill blades, those are good family supporting wages and that you can unionize, right? So I think it's all related, but unless we do something, it's all going to be a conversation for naught about economics because we've got to do something to protect the planet. And I think they're totally related, and we can't let anyone put a false equivalency out there.
Let's talk about the Progressive Caucus. You are co-chair with Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal from Washington State. What are your goals for the Progressive Caucus?
Well, I got to tell you, we yesterday met with our exec committee, and there's a huge list of what's coming up in the next few months. But I think one of the big promises we made was around prescription drug prices and lower prescription drug prices. So we've been instrumental, I think, in trying to work with leadership to have the strongest possible bill. We want to deal with immigration in a way that not all the caucus always has been there.
Back on prescription drugs, if I can. Healthcare, right?
Yeah.
And that's one aspect
healthcare,
of healthcare. Yeah,
one aspect, and as well as things like Medicare for all. I mean, it's our members who are leading that debate to make sure that every single person has coverage like virtually every other country, industrialized country.
You talked about semantic problem earlier, Congressman. Yeah. There's a semantic problem around Medicare for all, too. When you say Medicare for all, what do you mean? You're talking Bernie Sanders or Kamala Harris?
Yeah. So, I think a little bit of that debate, this is my opinion. This is not from my CPC hat.
That's why we're here.
I do think that sometimes we worry more about dotting I's and crossing T's on healthcare policy than understanding the big picture, which is I got PolitiFacted. As you know, people always are afraid to get PolitiFacted, and I got one of my rare truths, or a rare truth they give out, when I said we're the only industrialized country that doesn't have universal healthcare, and that's true. Now, there may be a different plan in Europe than there is Canada, but you know what? They have healthcare access in both places. I don't want to get lost on the dotting I's and crossing T's of policies, but the idea that everyone has access to healthcare in those countries is what we should be talking about as a value. Nancy Pelosi taught us when we first came to Congress, values unite, issues divide. And I really have taken that to heart. So I think we have to talk about it as a value. The Republicans have spent the last 2.5 years trying to take away people's health care, take away pre-existing condition coverage. we need to talk about that. That's the alternative, what they're trying to do, continue to have profits for insurance companies and others, rather than making sure that no matter who you are, you have access to health care. So in a way, I thought that last debate that I was at in Detroit, that second night, was a little bit unfortunate because we, I think, spent more time on dotting I's and crossing T's than we did on the value that every single person should have access. Now, that's a little more aggressive than some of the candidates are talking about, but I don't want to get lost on the exact plan. But we do have to make sure everyone's got health insurance. And that, I think, is the place we should be spending our time.
And as you say, prescription drugs takes it.
That's one of the biggest cost
drug prices
drivers, right,
step.
to healthcare. And it's one of the biggest cost drivers for healthcare. So that's why you want to address prescription drug prices. When, if you have hepatitis C, the good news is there's literally a miracle cure. 95% of people will be cured by it. The bad news is you have to take it for 90 days in a row. It's $1,000 a pill, and some insurance companies won't give you access to it. Well, that's ridiculous. It's virtually a cure for anyone with a disease, but the company that bought the company that came up with this, it wasn't their own money and research. They bought a company. In the first year alone, they paid for the company. The top 5 executives of this company that bought and made it a product, their bonuses would have covered curing everyone of Hep C in the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, and one other country. I mean, this is the abuse of what we see. But that's what's driving our costs on healthcare, that and a few other things. So, part of it is cost containment. There's a lot of things we got to do. But the bottom line is, it doesn't matter who you are, you should have access to healthcare. The old model where if you actually were sick and you needed it and couldn't get it, that was profit insurance, right, for insurance companies. Thanks to the Affordable Care Act, we now understand if you have a pre-existing condition, you have access. If you're a woman, you're not paying more for health care than a man, that you can stay on your parents' policy till you're 26. Those are all good things. But let's go farther. And I just think the Medicare model, to me, makes the most sense. It's a wildly popular program. That would be the best way to do it. But I'm not going to fight to the death over that. If someone else has a way to guarantee every single person through a single-payer system will have health care, I'm open to listen.
So from the point of view of the Progressive Caucus, there are so many exciting new young progressives elected to Congress, joining the progressives like yourself who are already here. There's still some conservative or moderate Democrats in the House who may not be where we would like to see them on the public policy issues. Is it okay for progressives to challenge incumbent members of Congress who are not progressive?
Yeah, thanks for that easy question, Bill. So the way I look at it is, if someone is just off of dead center from the Democrats, are they a conservative? No, I don't think that test should be applied to every single person. But there are some of our members who, if you don't support marriage equality and you don't support a woman's ability to make her decisions over her own body, you're pretty far out of the mainstream of our party, and I think that maybe we should have that conversation about whether or not you still serve the purpose to your district that you should as a Democrat. So I am not 100% against it, but I sometimes find people just want to challenge anyone because they've been here too long or any other reason, and I think you should have a stronger reason to take on someone. Maybe you're trying to make them vote more progressive. And I understand that could be a valid argument, but I do think that we have a few folks that I wish would realize that D is supposed to mean something when it follows their name.
At this time, the last count, there were still maybe 20 candidates running for president in 2020. Who's your candidate, Congressman?
Yeah, I don't have a candidate yet. Buying a little time. By the time it gets to Wisconsin, I assume there'll be 3 or 4 people in early April when we have our primary. Ideologically, I'm closest to probably people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. I have great respect for people like Beto O'Rourke. I consider a friend. I tell everyone back home when they ask about candidates, if you were selecting your neighbor or your brother-in-law, you would select Beto because he would probably shovel your walk before you got up because that's the kind of guy he is. I've served with Tim Ryan on appropriations. A couple more of them came in my class in Congress. So there's a lot of people I know and I like. So I'm trying not to piss off 19 of them in the meantime. But when it narrows down, I'm sure I'll get active.
You did not mention Joe Biden.
I didn't.
No. Is he on your list of people you'd be happy to support?
Anyone who comes to the Democratic primary, I will be enthusiastic about supporting against Donald Trump. But one of the nice things about primaries is you pick the people that you're values are the closest to, that you think will bring out more voters so we can, defeat Donald Trump. And I think one of the things that's important to me is people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and some others who are running can energize some of the voters that we need to come out that support us on the issues but don't always traditionally come out. I saw a poll recently on millennial voters where, again, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and I forgot someone else were really good at bringing them out, but Joe Biden was at 6%, tied with Andrew Yang. And we need those voters to come out to ensure not only we defeat Donald Trump, but maybe we pick up some U.S. Senate seats.
You and I had this conversation in 2016 about the message of the Democratic Party and regretting that the Democratic Party wasn't out there with a more progressive issue, particularly in the Heartland, where we didn't do so well.
Yeah.
Do you see any difference in 2020 in the message that the Democratic candidates are putting out there?
I mean, really, what a difference. All the candidates are talking about progressive policy right now, right? I mean, it's a huge victory. And I think we would all be remiss if we didn't recognize that had Bernie Sanders not run 4 years ago, we probably wouldn't be where we're at today, because we're talking about a lot of the issues he talked about that now we've had 4 years to build support on. But almost across the board, people are fighting. I mean, even on the fight on, healthcare, it's different versions of Medicare for all. You know what? Good. We're saying Medicare for all. We understand that everyone should have coverage, period. We should embrace that as a win, and let's go from there.
And Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Now, this is the key state. Maybe it may decide the whole thing. We know what happened with Wisconsin the last time when Hillary didn't even go there. Nobody knows the political landscape in Wisconsin better than you. You have a new governor. So has Wisconsin turned the corner? Are we going to do better in Wisconsin this time? What's your take?
So our problem last time was turnout. We had about a 250,000 Democratic voter drop-off. We also had a photo ID law that probably, according to the university, probably impacted about 40,000 people, and Donald Trump won by 23,000. But we got to give people a reason to come out and vote. First of all, we have a guarantee this time the Democratic nominee is coming to Wisconsin because the convention's in Milwaukee. So that's going to be different than last time. That's a good thing. But when they talk about the 10 swing...
I hope it's not the only time.
No, exactly. Trust me. They are coming back. Absolutely. And, I think Wisconsin, Donald Trump has had the biggest drop-off of any state he won. And a big part of it is all the tariffs he's doing. Donald Trump doesn't really understand trade. He said the right things in 2016. He was going to bring jobs back. On the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, Hillary Clinton said, I don't support the TPP as currently written. Ooh, inspirational. Where, when you said, I'm going to bring those jobs back, people are like, all right, we'll give him a try. But he hasn't done that. And now his war with China and other countries via Twitter on tariffs, our farmers are hurting big time.
Do they tell you that in Wisconsin? Do they know that they're hurting because of Donald Trump's
tariffs? Yeah, I just had the
tariffs?
Wisconsin Farmers Union in my office, about 15 farmers, and they'll tell you how bad it is. I mean, it's been awful. In fact, one of them national leaders has been a Farmers Union spokesperson out of Minnesota talking about how bad what the tariffs are doing. So absolutely, and that's part of the message that's getting out there. So you've had, we now have articles about suicides on dairy farms. About losing record numbers of farms. I mean, this is now what's in the press in Wisconsin. So that is not going to be good for Donald Trump. And I think that we're in a position to take our state back, but not if we ignore it. If people don't come to Wisconsin like they need to, the candidate has to come more than once. We have to talk about agriculture issues and antitrust issues, because that came up at our meeting, and all the other things that real people talk about in Wisconsin. And if we do that, I think we'll be fine.
Bill Press talking with Congressman Mark Pocan of Wisconsin. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressShow.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Johnathan Metzl, Christopher Leonard, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.